Hello, everybody. It's good to be back again for our time of Bible study together as we try to make sense of life. We're looking at those ancient stories, those stories in the book of Genesis at the very beginning of our Bible, because those stories lay the foundation stones, if you will, for a biblical worldview. We're going to keep looking at these stories, not really taking them apart as many times pastors and theologians love to do, but really looking at them sort of standing back to hear them in the way that the first hearers or readers might have heard them, to hear the underlying story that's there, to hear what is there that helps us understand why the world is the way it is, to help us see and understand our world. In short, we want to make sense of life. And what I have found as I've looked at these narratives, these stories in the first 12 chapters of Genesis, is they help us make sense of life. They also help us make sense of the Bible. If we can just keep coming back to them, the foundation stones are there for everything that we encounter. When we're with Isaiah, we need to remember who God is in Genesis. When we are with the prophets, we need to remember, what's going on with humanity in the beginning. When we get to Jesus also, we need to look and see what was happening at the beginning. Because these stories, these narratives that we are going to read in Genesis, provide also the foundation for the lives of all the people that come after. Moses knew these stories. King David heard these stories, and Solomon. The prophets heard these stories, Jeremiah, Isaiah. Their minds and worldviews were formed by these stories. Peter, James, and John grew up hearing these stories. Their lives were also shaped and formed by these narratives. Jesus grew up hearing these stories. And so we too need to hear these stories not just as children's Bible stories. We need to hear these stories and these narratives as the foundation stones for a biblical worldview so that we can make sense of life. And so we begin in chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. For us, words perhaps so familiar, but what we see here is that God is very intentionally creating the heavens and the earth in the surrounding lands during the time that these narratives came into being. And the surrounding kingdoms and lands and peoples, their stories of creation weren't like that. The creation was more of an accident. It was a byproduct of a battle. It was something that happened, and suddenly there were people and animals and things. Here we have the Creator, the God of the universe, deciding to intentionally and purposefully create everything that is. And so one of the foundation stones we have is that everything that exists on purpose. God created the world and everything in it. And then God also brought order to chaos. Our God is a God of order. He wants to bring order to the mess of the world. And so in the beginning, the earth was formless, it was void. There was nothing there. And God came into that and he spoke into creation all the things that exist. And so our God brings order into the world. When we look around us and there's chaos and destruction, that's not something from God. God is a God of order. God is a God of purpose. God creates the world in those 6 days. He begins by creating light and then land and separating the waters and then the stars and the moon and then the plants and the animals, and finally God creates humankind. There's an order to it, a progression. One can't exist without the other one already existing. We needed this one before we get to this one, and this one had to exist before we get to this one. And so there's an orderly progression of creation. And finally God gets to the man and the woman, and he says, male and female, I create them in my image. And so God creates us in God's image. So there's something about us. There's something about you and me and every human being that is godlike. We are not gods. That's a problem. We're going to run into that later. But there is something from God in each of us, in me and in my neighbor and in my son and in my mother and in my enemy and in the person who offends me. All human beings, according to Scripture, are made in the image of God. There is something of God's image in every one of us. That's astounding. And so, I'll just stop there for a minute to say that this worldview that we're finding here as we make sense of life changes the way or forms the way that we see the world around us. God created everything that we have, therefore it's not just there for us to consume. He created it and then says, you are stewards over this world. It's my world, God says. I'm going to leave you as stewards. I'm going to put you as stewards over this world. Care for it. So we're to care for it, not just destroy it randomly and for personal gain. We're to care for this world. There's a mandate here of world caring that we have. And then there's the fact that we're created in God's image says that you and I and everyone around us in this world, all 7 billion plus people in this world, are created in the image of God. That is amazing and fascinating and fantastic to know. Isn't it great to know that you are created in the image of God? You and I and everyone around us created in the image of God. Chapter 7 ends, and God declares that the things that he has made, as he steps back at the end of that chapter and looks, God declares it is very good. And so it's not just that it's good, he declares it very good. It's beautiful. So we just need to remember that as we look at the world around us. It is beautiful. We've stood by the sea and watched the waves and thought, oh, the power and majesty of God. And we've seen the sunsets and, oh, the beauty of God. Well, even that weed, thing we consider a weed, well, that's also a creature or creation of God. And yeah, clean our lawns up, but it's all created by God and it's good. So we need to remember that as well. In the second chapter, we sort of focus in. In the first chapter, we look at the big picture. God creates the heavens and the earth. But in the second chapter, we see that the story sort of moves in right to human beings and right to those very first human beings. And it's amazing. God creates the garden and puts the man in the garden. That is so crazy contrary to all of the stories of creation in the surrounding part of the world when these stories came out. In the surrounding cultures and worldviews, human beings existed to serve as servants and slaves their God. Here we have a God who creates a garden for the human and puts the human in it. Here, I've made you a garden and I'm putting you in it. He is caring for the human rather than the human taking care of the God. It was an amazing story when it came out. When it first hit the press, if you will, some 4,000 years ago. People who heard this were like, what? God created a garden for human beings? That's crazy. But that's exactly what God did. God creates the garden, puts the human being in it, and in a sense says, I'm going to take care of you. I love you, and I want to care for you. In that garden, he puts every kind of plant, every kind of tree. There's all kinds of fruits and vegetables growing everywhere. And in the very center of the garden, God puts a tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and says to the human, do not eat of that tree. Just that one tree. You've got, look, acres and acres of stuff everywhere around you. Anything you want, you eat, you enjoy, take care of it. He also put him in there to work. Take care of it, but don't eat of that one tree. And that was absolutely crucial for God to put that tree there, because without the presence of that tree, humanity would have no choice. You see, God had to give humanity the ability to say no to him. If we were going to say yes to him, we had to be able to say no. With no, then is it really a yes? There's no other way. And so God, by planting the tree in the center of the garden, creates free will for humanity. That ability for us to choose to say yes to God or to say no to God. And of course, there's a little foreshadowing there. Chapter 3 that we're going to get to tonight sort of tells us what happens. God creates the garden, puts man in it. He also then takes and creates woman from his side, remember? Not from his feet, that Adam should be able to trample on her, not from his head, that she's going to rule over him, but right from his side. Because the idea is that they should walk side by side. We'd already seen in chapter 1 that God says that man and woman are both created in his image. And so this just again solidifies that sense of caring for one another, loving one another, walking beside each other, an equality with each other that they're to have as they go through life. The man is not to be some dictator over her, and she's not to be some witch over him. They are to walk together side by side, helping each other, loving each other. And so they're in the garden. And then we get to chapter 3. And chapter 3 is where things fall apart. It all just goes, all right, are we ready for this? We're going to take chapter 3 in two pieces because there is so much in that chapter for us to see to help us understand this world that we live in. So I'm going to be reading in Genesis chapter 3, and I'll be reading verses 1 through 7 this evening. You can follow along in your own Bible if you want, or if you just want to listen. You know, faith comes by hearing, not reading, hearing. So if you want to just listen to the words, you'll be like the very first hearers of these stories who had no books. Okay, so just pretend you're back in that time, and here's how the story went. Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, the serpent says to the woman, has God indeed said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. Then the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. God knows that in the day you eat that, your eyes are going to be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit, and she ate it. And she gave it to her husband with her, and he ate it. And the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. This is the chapter that we call the fall. God has created a good world. Everything there is in balance. It is put together beautifully. He makes man and woman, and they are together. And they have the freedom of choice. And they come to the tree in the middle of the garden, and they make a choice. Many people say that this is a story of disobedience. I don't think it's a story of disobedience. And we're going to unpack that, and I think we're going to see that when the first people heard this story, they didn't hear that this was a story of disobedience. First of all, there's this serpent. Now, many people say, well, the serpent's Satan, it's the devil. Well, it never says that. It just says a serpent. It's a crafty beast, but it is something in God's creation that is contrary to God. It is something that has the choice to operate against God and has chosen to somehow move against the will of God. And not only is the serpent content to do that, but the serpent also is ready to help the woman to do something against the will of God. And there's this wonderful little conversation. Did God say you can't eat from any of the trees in the garden? Look at all these trees and you can't eat from any of them? Which is ridiculous. That's not at all what God had said. It's the opposite almost. And she says, no. We can eat of every tree except for the one there in the middle. That tree over there, we can't touch it. Can't even touch it, we'll die. And the serpent, you're not going to die. You eat that fruit, you're going to be like God. In effect, you're going to become a god. Your eyes are going to be opened and you're going to know good and evil. Yay. Do we really want to know that? I guess Adam and Eve did. And she goes to the tree and she's not by herself. The scripture is very clear. It says her husband was with her. It's not like he was, wandering around. I'd often thought as a child that perhaps she had taken the fruit and tasted it, and then she went and found Adam and said, hey, try this, and tricked him into trying it, and he ate it, and, oh, it's the forbidden fruit. No, he was right there with her. He may have been like, you've seen those guys at Walmart, right? They're with their wives, and they're just sort of, shuffling along behind them. I don't know. They're supposed to be walking side by side. I'm hoping they were still walking side by side, maybe even hand in hand. And with her free hand, as she held his hand, with her free hand, she took the fruit and she ate it. And then she turned and let him take a bite. He was completely conscious of what was going on. He knew what was happening. He was right there beside her and with her. But I'm going to argue that this is not really a case of disobedience. And I'm going to say that because, man, after reading this story so many times, and after examining my own life, here's something that I've come to be very aware of. And when I say it, you're going to be like, well, yeah, that's true. I hope that's the way you feel. How many times in our lives do we consciously say, I am going to disobey? When we were children, did we ever say, I'm going to disobey my parents? I want to disobey my parents. As adults, whether we're serving in the workplace or the military or wherever else, how often do we say, I want to disobey, I want to do something against the will of? That doesn't really happen. In my own life, I've learned that disobedience really is more of, it's a secondary sin. That there's something else going on inside of us. I remember when I was a youngster, I was about 15 years old. We were living on the island of Grenada. My parents were missionaries. Many of you know that. And so we were living in Grenada. I had already gotten my driver's license. That's a whole other story. My parents trusted me, allowed me to take the car from time to time. And well, there was this young lady, Claudia, that I'd met, and her dad was like the Bolivian ambassador. And so I had said, hey, you want to go down to the Red Crab tonight and throw darts with the rest of the folks? Red Crab was a little restaurant and pub near our house. And there was a dart room in the back where the young people would hang out, and we would drink, limeade and just, have a good time. It was very, very safe and a very good place. And my parents were perfectly fine with me doing this. And so I said, Dad, can I borrow the car? Claudia said she will go to the Red Crab. And he was like, sure, it's a Saturday night. He said, just, we got church tomorrow, be home at 11 o'clock. Now, my hearing was perfect. I understand English. Dad said, be home at 11 o'clock. I picked up Claudia. We went down. All the kids from the area were there. We were just throwing darts, having fun, telling stories of school. And I looked down at my watch, and it's like 10 till 11. And nobody has left yet. And nobody wants to leave. And I don't want to leave. And I stayed. And we played darts. And we drank some more lime squash. And about 11:15, I said, Claudia, I got to go. And she said, okay. And I dropped her off at her house, and I went back to my house. I got home after 11:30. Now, on the surface, John, you disobeyed your dad. And I did. I did. But here's the thing. I did not want to disobey my dad. I had no intention of disobeying my dad. In fact, I did not want to disobey my dad. I did not want to disappoint my dad. I did not want to go against his will. I did not want to do that. It was not my intention, hope, or desire. There was something else going on deeper inside of me. Jesus talks about this. Jesus talks about this in Matthew 15. He's talking to his disciples, and he says, he was in this conversation about, whether it was right to eat without washing your hands and unclean food. And Jesus says, it's not the stuff that goes into your mouth that defiles you. Those things go in through your stomach and they're eliminated from your system. But it's the things that come out of your mouth that defile you. It's the things within you that lead to wickedness and adulteries and greed and envy. Jesus states it very clearly there in Matthew 15. I'm just going to look at the verse real quick. Some of you may be going, where is that? It's in Matthew chapter 15 and verses 18. Those things that come out of the mouth from the heart, the evil thoughts, the murders, the adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies, verses 18 and 19 of Matthew 15. Those are the things that defile us. And so there was something behind the disobedience going on at the Red Crab that night in my own mind. There was something else going on. And you know what it was probably a couple of things. One was pride. I don't want to leave. Everybody else is here. Why can't I be here too? And part of it was fear. What are people going to think if Heron's the one that leaves early? The first one out of here. Everybody else is staying till closing time probably. And here Heron on a Saturday night has to be home at 11 o'clock. And so there was fear of being rejected, and there was the pride of wanting to seem a certain way among my friends. And those were the sins. Those were the sins that led to the disobedience because I had no intention and no desire to disobey. But I had every intention and every desire of appearing better, stronger, faster, of appearing like, I can just do what I want to because here I am out with Claudia and I can just do what I want to. Those were the sins of my heart that overflowed and came out of disobedience. And so when we come back to the garden, as Eve is standing there holding hands with Adam, and she reaches up to that tree, I don't believe that she was saying to herself, I want to disobey God. I want to do exactly what God said not to do. I don't think that's the way she was thinking. I think she was thinking a different way, but we in the church have come to say that this first and original sin was really disobedience. And in fact, we've written hymns, right, that talk about that. What's that famous hymn that we still love to sing? I love to sing the song. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey, because Adam and Eve disobeyed and they're not happy, is the rest of the message of that song. And so the idea is that there was disobedience, but it's interesting if you look at Genesis 3, you never find the word disobey, and you never find the word disobedience. They don't exist. And so the original hearers would probably have not equated the problem here with disobedience. They would have probably thought that there was something, because that's a surface and visible sin. They were probably looking and thinking there's something going on inside. There's something going on deep inside. When I taught English for many, many years, English 1301, one of my favorite classes, it was great. I would always get to the point of worldviews and talk about that because it's fun to do with young people, with young adults. And I would always ask that question. We'd get to that point where we're looking at a story and a character, and I would ask the question, are humans basically good or basically bad? And I would go ahead and say, go ahead and get into groups of 3 or 4 and discuss it and bring back your answer. And there's a lot of discussion. Are human beings basically good or are they basically bad? And they would kick these ideas around and there would be lots of banter. It was good. It was fun. But of course, if you know anything about logic, what I've really done is I've handed them a logical fallacy. I've said it has to be either A or B, when in fact there are other options. It's a false dichotomy. And so they would talk about it and they would blah, 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 and they would say, this, we're good because of this, and others would say, no, we're basically bad. And then I would say, well, maybe there's another proposition, another possibility. Maybe there's a different way to think about us. And I would start with the birth of a child. Now, if you're a parent, as Jeannie and I are parents, we know that the moment that a child is born, a child is absolutely 100% completely self-absorbed. Human beings are born absolutely selfish, completely consumed with self. The baby's hungry, feed me. I'm cold, make me warm. I'm lonely, be with me. I'm wet, change me. Babies are just completely consumed with their own personal feelings and pleasure and everything else. It's all about me, 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 me. I believe that is, in fact, the problem with all of humanity, is that we are born selfish. And we don't just grow out of it. Have you had a 3-year-old in your house? Have you had a teenager in your house? Have you had an adult around you? We don't naturally grow out of our selfishness. And yet selfishness and self-absorption is exactly the thing that is completely and diametrically opposed to the good news of Jesus Christ. Allow me to explain. Jesus is talking to his disciples. It's in the Gospel of John, chapter 15. And Jesus says these words, "Greater love has no one than this, than they lay down their life for their friend." Okay? Now, what does that take? How do we lay down our lives for someone else? We have to completely forget ourselves and think on the other person. That's what we have to do, right? When Jesus was calling his disciples, Jesus says, If you wish to be my disciple, you must deny who? Yourself. Take up your cross and follow me. Wow. Again, the denial of self. The problem with humanity, in other words, is that humanity is born selfish. We're born full of ourselves. And so as Eve stood there hand in hand with Adam and she reaches up to take that fruit, what's going through her mind is not, oh, I'm going to disobey God. Her thought is, I'm going to be like God. I'm going to be powerful. If I don't eat this, I'm going to miss out. It's the first case of FOMO, right? It's the first case of FOMO in the world is Eve standing at that tree, the fear of missing out. If I don't eat this, what might I miss? And boy, wouldn't I like to have my eyes open to see good and evil, and wouldn't I like to be wise? She wasn't thinking, I'm going to disobey God. She was thinking completely of herself. She didn't even think about, how is this going to impact my relationship with my husband? No thought. I want this. And that is the cry of the human heart. I want what I want, when I want, how I want. And that, I believe, is the original sin that we find in the Garden of Eden. It's going to change everything. Jesus was questioned, what's the greatest commandment? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There's got to be a time when we say no to ourselves, when we deny ourselves, when we put others first. I am convinced that as parents, we should not be trying to teach our children to be good rather than bad. Those are sort of fuzzy and unclear. If we would focus instead on teaching our children to be selfless rather than selfish, to think of others instead of just themselves, we would change this world. Teach our children good and bad. We know that cultures have different levels of goodness and badness and what's right and wrong. But selflessness and selfishness, that covers and crosses every cultural barrier and every language barrier. If we could learn to be more selfless and less selfish, what a world we would live in. And I believe that when the first hearers of these narratives, when they heard this story of Adam and Eve, they heard right away, she wants to be like God. She wants to be like God. She wants it for herself. And so the next foundation stone for understanding life and understanding our world is simply this. The human beings around us are not good or bad. They do good things and bad things. But they're all, to a degree, selfish. If human beings are basically bad, then how do we explain the goodness that we see? How do we explain the things that people do to help others? It's hard to explain if humanity is bad. And if humanity is basically good, how can we explain the horrors and the wars, the violence, the greed? Beneath all of the greed and the arrogance and all of those things, at the very bottom of our souls, there is a selfishness that drives us, something that's pushing us to focus on ourselves and do what we want to do, and we don't care about anyone else. So, we have people who are selfish, and then people get in groups, and there can be families that are selfish, and there can be corporations that are selfish. Right now in the news, we've got Google, and I don't know if they're being selfish, but man, they sure are running everything. And hopefully they're not being selfish. Hopefully it's just happened and there's an explanation. But Corporations and companies and factories can become selfish communities, greedy. Governments can become selfish, and they make nations selfish. There is that thin line between patriotism, I love my country, and nationalism. My country is better than every other's, and it doesn't matter what we do to stay on top. That is crossing a line. May we be people who hear the words of Jesus, even as we've heard the words of Genesis. If anyone wants to be my disciple, she must deny themselves, take up their cross and follow me. God was already saying that all the way back in Genesis. The problem is selfishness. Next week, we're going to finish chapter 3. We're going to find out what happens. The result of this sin, this selfishness that leads to disobedience, it leads to a broken world. And what does that mean? And what does it mean for us? These are going to be foundational ideas. Again, they're going to help us to understand ourselves, the world we live in, and the scriptures that we read. So I hope you join us. Thank you for being with us tonight. Sort of a dark one tonight, right? Looking at all the selfishness after a couple of weeks of creation and good and bright. Now we're getting to humanity. Humanity brings in a few problems for the story, but it's going to help us understand this world. Thank you for being with us. May you have a great evening. God bless, and we'll see you next week right here. Until then, bye-bye.